He said I couldn't handle pressure. I handled pressure at 40,000 feet with an engine on fire over hostile territory. The reunion was held in the high school gymnasium, a place that still smelled faintly of floor wax, adolescent sweat, and decades of disappointment. Paper streamers in our old school colors, a faded navy blue and a tired-looking gold, drooped from the basketball hoops, sagging under the weight of 30 years of gravity. A DJ in the corner played music from our youth, songs about summer nights and rebellion that felt hollow and ironic under the fluorescent glare. Men who had been titans on the football field were now soft in the middle, their boasts about touchdowns replaced with talk of quarterly earnings and nagging sciatica. Women who had been queens of the prom clutched glasses of cheap white wine, their smiles a little too tight, their eyes scanning the room for validation, or perhaps for an escape. I stood near the back, by the bleachers, nursing a bottle of domestic beer. The condensation was cold against my palm, a small, solid anchor in a sea of forced cheerfulness and manufactured nostalgia. I wore what I always wore, worn denim, scuffed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. It was comfortable. It was honest. It was also, I knew, a kind of armor. It declared that I was not participating in the charade. I was an observer, a ghost at a feast I had no appetite for. My 2010 Ford F-150, with its coat of honorable rust and a dent in the fender from a stubborn fence post, was parked out back, away from the newer, shinier sedans and SUVs. It was paid for. It started every time. That was enough. That was when I saw Todd making his way toward me. He moved through the crowd like a minor monarch, a backslap here, a booming laugh there. Todd had been the class president, the quarterback, the guy everyone assumed was destined for greatness. His version of greatness, it turned out, was a regional manager position at a mid-level insurance firm. He wore a navy blazer with a crest on the pocket, chinos pressed to a razor's edge, and loafers with little tassels that seemed to dance with smug satisfaction. He carried his success like a shield, polished and bright, deflecting any possibility of self-doubt. "Janet Barnes," he boomed, his voice unnecessarily loud as if he were still calling a play in a crowded stadium. "I almost didn't recognize you. You dropped off the map completely after everything." I took a slow sip of my beer. The liquid was lukewarm. "Hello, Todd." "So fill me in," he said, leaning against the bleachers with an air of magnanimous curiosity. He folded his arms, a gesture meant to convey relaxed authority. "What's the story? Last I heard you joined the Air Force of all things. Did that last long? We never heard from you. No Christmas cards, no updates on social media. It's like you vanished." His words were a probe, disguised as friendly concern. The subtext was clear. "You failed, didn't you?" His eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of my clothes. "Your life is a disappointment, and I am here, successful and benevolent, to hear all about it." The small crowd of onlookers, our former classmates, edged closer, sensing the possibility of drama. A tribunal was forming, and I was the one in the dock. The pressure in the room was a familiar thing, just a different flavor. It wasn't the crushing G-force of a high-speed turn or the cold dread of a system failure alarm. It was social pressure, emotional pressure, the pressure to explain, to justify, to perform. He thought it was a weapon. He had no idea I'd been inoculated against it by forces he couldn't possibly comprehend. My silence was a habit born of necessity, but its foundation was laid long before I ever saw the inside of a cockpit. It was forged at a mahogany dining room table, under the low, disapproving gaze of my father. I was 18, just a week after graduation, and I had just told him I'd enlisted. My mother had wrung her hands, her face a mask of worry. My father had simply placed his fork and knife down with a quiet, deliberate click. "The military," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He tasted the word as if it were something rancid. Janet, this family has a tradition of service. You know that. Your grandfather was a doctor. I am a lawyer. We serve our community through respectable, professional means. The Air Force is respectable, I had said, my own voice smaller than I wanted it to be. For a man, perhaps. As a mechanic, a pilot even. But for a woman, it's a place to find a husband and not a very good one at that. You'll wash out of basic training inside a month. You don't have the temperament for it. You're too sensitive. He picked up his fork again, a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. You can't handle that kind of pressure. You will come home with your tail between your legs, and we will have to figure out what to do with you then. He wasn't a cruel man, not intentionally. He was a product of his time, a man who believed in a certain order to the world, a world where men built things and women managed them, where success was measured in property deeds and club memberships, not in knots or altitude ceilings. His words weren't meant to wound me. They were meant to be a statement of fact, as undeniable as the law of gravity. He, like Todd, saw a version of me that didn't exist. They couldn't see the steel core he had inadvertently helped to forge. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or storm away from the table. I simply sat there, finished my dinner in silence, and felt something shift inside me. A door closed. I understood in that moment that there were entire worlds I would inhabit that people like my father and people like Todd would never have the clearance to enter. Explaining it to them would be like describing color to a man born blind, a futile exercise. So I chose silence. Silence became my doctrine. Todd was still waiting for an answer, his smile fixed in place. So the Air Force? What did you do? Push paper around at some desk in Ohio? Something like that, I said. They thought I'd dropped off the map. In a way, they were right. I had. I'd spent the better part of 2 decades on maps that were classified top secret, maps where the borders were fluid and the names of towns were redacted, while Todd was learning how to upsell life insurance policies in conference rooms that smelled of stale coffee and recycled air. I was learning a different set of skills. I learned the language of the cockpit, the feel of afterburners kicking in, a brutal, beautiful shove in the small of my back, the taste of recycled oxygen, metallic and dry, the sight of the Earth's curvature from a height that rendered all human conflict small and petty. While they were attending company picnics and worrying about their 401s, I was at Edwards. The Mojave Desert was my office, the sky was my laboratory. My colleagues weren't salesmen, they were engineers from Lockheed's Skunk Works and Northrop Grumman, men and women who spoke in acronyms and equations, whose idea of small talk was debating the aerodynamic properties of a new wing design. We didn't talk about our feelings, we talked about performance envelopes, structural integrity, and telemetry data. Our bonds weren't forged over beers at a happy hour. They were forged in the silent, shared understanding of the risks we took every time the wheels left the tarmac. They imagined failure. I lived a life of meticulously calculated risks. They thought I was hiding. I was operating in a world that required absolute discretion. The silence they interpreted as shame was, in fact, the highest form of operational security. I couldn't tell them about the prototype I flew that flirted with Mach 3, its titanium skin glowing cherry red from the friction of the atmosphere. I couldn't describe the gut-wrenching terror of a flat spin at 50,000 feet, and the cold, clinical calm that takes over as you fight the controls, your mind working through emergency procedures faster than you can consciously think. I couldn't talk about the incident over the Barents Sea, when a routine reconnaissance flight in a heavily modified RC-135 turned into a nightmare. The electrical fire that filled the cockpit with acrid smoke, The cascade of warning lights, a Christmas tree of catastrophic failures, the shouted, clipped reports over the intercom, the feeling of the aircraft bucking like a wild horse. My job wasn't to fly it, but to manage the systems, to keep the mission-critical intelligence gathering equipment from frying, to calmly report data back to a satellite that was already half a world away. I handled that pressure. I compartmentalized the fear, boxed it up, and did my job. We landed with one engine, no hydraulics, and the prayers of every soul on board. No one got a medal for that day. Our reward was silence. The mission never happened. The report was buried so deep, it would never see the light of day. Todd saw a woman in a flannel shirt. He couldn't see the woman who had held the lives of a 20-person crew in her steady hands, her voice never wavering as she called out checklist items while the world was coming apart around her. Something like that, I repeated, my voice even. I gave him nothing. No details, no justification. My refusal to elaborate was like a red flag to a bull. His affable mask slipped, revealing the deep-seated insecurity beneath. He needed to be the most important person in any given room, and my quiet refusal to acknowledge his status was an affront. "Look, Janet, there's no shame in it," he said, his tone shifting to one of condescending pity. He was performing now for the small crowd that had gathered. "Not everyone is cut out for that life. It takes a certain kind of toughness, a certain ability to handle pressure. I see it every day in my line of work. Sales is a high-pressure environment. You're constantly being judged, constantly having to perform. Every quarter you live or die by the numbers." An internal, bitter laugh caught in my throat. He was comparing his quarterly sales reports to a mission debrief. He thought a hashtag was a strategy. He thought pressure was missing a bonus. "You know," he continued, warming to his theme, "I hear these stories all the time. People join up thinking it's going to be like the movies. Then they find out it's real work, real discipline. They can't hack it, so they get out after a couple of years and they don't want to talk about it. It's a classic case of stolen valor, almost. Not that you're doing that, of course, but you build it up in your head and then the reality is just disappointing." The term stolen valor hung in the air. He didn't know the weight of those words. He just knew it was a cudgel he could use. It was the ultimate insult, the one thing that could cut through the armor of any legitimate veteran. He was accusing me of being a fraud, a liar, a pretender, all because I wouldn't give him the story he wanted, the story of my failure that would validate his own mediocre success. My hand, the one holding the beer, was perfectly steady. My breathing remained slow and even, a practiced rhythm from thousands of hours on oxygen. I watched him. His face was getting flushed. A small vein pulsed in his temple. His bluster was a symptom of a deep-seated weakness. He was a faulty instrument, broadcasting his own instability. "You never served, did you, Todd?" I asked. My voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through his monologue like a scalpel. He sputtered for a moment. "Well, no, I had a football scholarship, a knee injury, or besides, my talents were better suited to the business world, building the economy. That's a form of service too, you know, a patriot's duty." "I see," I said, and I did. He recovered quickly, turning back to his audience. "The point is, some people are built for pressure and some aren't. And there's no shame in admitting you're not. Better to find your niche. Like me, I found mine, President's Club, 5 years running." He tapped the crest on his blazer. "It's about results, not just stories." He was closing in for the kill. He saw my silence as surrender. He smiled, a wide, predatory grin. "So come on, Janet, fess up. What really happened? Did you just spend 4 years filing paperwork and decide it wasn't for you?" Before I could answer, not that I would have, a different voice sliced through the humid gymnasium air. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, deep, and carried an effortless authority that made Todd's manufactured confidence sound like the yapping of a small dog. The small crowd parted. A man in his late 60s was standing there. He wasn't in uniform, just a well-tailored gray suit, but his posture was ramrod straight. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made you instinctively check your own bearing. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, scanned the scene with a practiced, analytical gaze. He radiated a stillness that was more commanding than any amount of noise. He looked past Todd, his eyes locking directly onto mine. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a warm, respectful smile. "Colonel Barnes," he said. The title landed in the space between us with the force of a physical blow. The air went still. Todd's smug expression began to curdle into confusion. The word colonel didn't fit his narrative. It was a piece of data his processor couldn't compute. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "General Morrison, I didn't expect to see you here." "My brother-in-law was in this class," the general said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, though it was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was dragged along, but this is a fortunate coincidence. I was going to call your office on Monday." Todd blinked. "Her office?" General Morrison ignored him completely, his focus entirely on me. "I wanted to tell you personally. The X-47 modifications you tested, the ones with the new avionics package you were so insistent about, well, you were right. They saved a pilot over the Pacific last week. A complete engine flameout during a carrier landing. The automated system you helped refine brought him in perfectly. Lockheed sends their gratitude. They want you as a consultant on the next-gen platform." The information settled over the small crowd. Each word was a nail in the coffin of Todd's narrative. Ix Chetredismit Septini. Avionics, Lockheed, Pacific. These were words from a world he didn't know existed, a world of consequence and high stakes. I saw the sequence of emotions play across Todd's face. First, confusion, then dawning comprehension, followed by a wave of sickening public humiliation. His face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. The beer bottle in his hand, forgotten, slipped from his sweaty grasp and shattered on the gymnasium floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the sudden, profound silence. No one moved. And then the final, devastating act. General Richard Morrison, a man who had likely commanded entire wings, a man who had briefed presidents and held the fate of nations in his hands, took one step back. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with a faint, sharp click, and raised his right hand. His movements were precise, economical, and imbued with a lifetime of discipline. He rendered a perfect textbook salute. His hand sliced through the air, fingers and thumb extended and joined, palm down, stopping with the forefinger touching the outer edge of his right eyebrow. His arm was parallel to the deck. It was a gesture of profound, unambiguous respect, a salute from a general officer to a colonel, an acknowledgement of service, of sacrifice, of a shared code that no one else in that room could ever understand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity, "it's an honor to see you again. You're a legend at Edwards." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. In that one simple gesture, the entire social hierarchy of the room, of our entire 30 years since graduation, was not just inverted, it was obliterated. Todd, the self-proclaimed king of this small pond, was reduced to a sputtering, irrelevant footnote. His blazer, his title, his sales awards, they were all just cheap props in a play that had suddenly been canceled. He was a man holding a participation trophy in the presence of an Olympian. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I held the general's gaze for a long moment. Then, as is customary, I brought my beer bottle up in a slow, deliberate motion and took the last swallow. I gave him a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement, the military equivalent of a returned salute in a civilian setting. "Good to see you too, Richard," I said. He dropped his salute and the spell was broken. The onlookers, who had been holding their collective breath, began to mutter amongst themselves, their eyes darting from the general to me, and finally to the pathetic, shattered figure of Todd, standing in a puddle of cheap beer. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or worse, had just seen himself for the first time. The general gestured toward the exit. "Let me buy you a real drink, Janet. There's a quiet place down the road. I want to hear your take on the preliminary report." "I'd like that," I said. We walked away, leaving Todd in the wreckage of his own making. I didn't look back. There was nothing to see. The bar was dark, smelling of old wood and good whiskey. We sat in a booth in the corner. The general ordered 2 single malts, neat. We didn't talk about the reunion or about Todd. It was irrelevant, a piece of social static that had been filtered out. We talked about the pilot, a young major with a wife and 2 kids. We talked about the telemetry data from the landing. We talked about the frustrating bureaucracy at the Pentagon and the genius of the young engineers who were designing things I couldn't have dreamed of when I first started. It was a real conversation. We spoke the same language. There was no need for performance, no need to justify my existence. My worth was a known quantity. Later, driving home in my old pickup, the rumble of the V8 engine was a comforting, familiar sound. The windows were down, and the cool night air of the desert swept through the cab. The lights of the town receded in my rearview mirror until they were just a faint, insignificant glimmer. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was a quiet, profound sense of peace. Todd and the people in that gym measured their lives in noise. They broadcast their every minor achievement, desperate for an audience, terrified of being forgotten. They lived in a world of surfaces, of appearances, of carefully curated images. My life had been lived in the silent places, in the deep, empty blue of the stratosphere, in the windowless confines of a secure briefing room, in the quiet intensity of a cockpit during a pre-flight check. I had learned that the most important things are often the things that are never said. The trust between a pilot and her ground crew, the unspoken bond with the engineer who designed the wing you're betting your life on, the silent prayer you offer up when the wheels touch down after a difficult run. My father had been wrong. He said I couldn't handle pressure. The truth was, I thrived in it. But I had no interest in the kind of pressure he understood. The pressure to conform, to impress, to be loud. The silence he and Todd mistook for failure was my sanctuary. It was my discipline. It was the space where the real work was done. They could have their noisy, crowded rooms and their desperate need for applause. I had the sky,